Okay, I think Lanterns might have something here because I'm not gonna lie, this episode starts a little slow. It definitely does take its time introducing this version of Hal and John and setting up the world, but the longer it went, the more invested I got. And once they actually get into this investigation in Nebraska, that's when it really started clicking for me. It's grounded, it's definitely taken that detective approach we've heard so much about, but it still feels like Green Lantern. The rings are there, the constructs are there, the aliens are there. They're just not throwing everything at us, in episode 1. And by the time the episode ended, yeah, I need episode 2. So, we're going to keep this pretty short week to week. I'm not trying to turn every episode into a 15-minute breakdown, but spoiler free, I thought this was a great premiere. Like I said, it's definitely a slow burn at first. We're meeting Hal Jordan and John Stewart, learning what their relationship is like, and getting introduced to this version of the Green Lantern world. And one of the smartest decisions they made was not giving us another full origin story. This is already an established DC universe. Hal has been doing this for years. John has already been chosen. The Green Lantern Corps exists. Aliens exist. And the episode gives you the information you need naturally as the story moves along. Even if you know nothing about Green Lantern, I don't think you're going to be lost. And if you already know these characters, we're not sitting through 30 minutes of shit we already know. I also really liked Kyle Chandler and Aaron Pierre together. Their relationship is interesting because one minute Hal and John seem like they genuinely enjoy being around each other, and then 5 minutes later, I'm wondering if these two even like each other. There's clearly history and tension there that we haven't fully seen yet, and that's actually pretty fitting for their comic history. John first appears in 1971's Green Lantern number 87, where the Guardians select him to serve as Hal's backup. Hal initially doesn't agree with the choice and doesn't particularly like John's methods, but eventually realizes why the Guardians chose him. Obviously, the show is doing its own thing, but the idea of Hal having to train someone he isn't completely sold on goes all the way back to John's introduction. And then there's the thing I was probably most curious about going into this: how grounded are we talking? Because you can give me True Detective with Green Lanterns, that's cool. But at some point, I still need Green Lanterns. And I think they found a really good balance in this first episode. They use the powers pretty minimally, little construct, simple uses of the ring, nothing crazy yet. And I actually like that. It's enough to remind you what these guys can do without completely overpowering the detective story they're trying to tell. So, yeah, spoiler free, great first episode. And if you haven't watched it yet, this is where you should probably leave because from here on out, full spoilers. Also, I didn't watch the episode 2 preview after the episode finished. I'm going to try to avoid those all season. I'd rather be surprised every Sunday and actually build theories around what the show itself has given us. So let's get into it. I really liked how they handled the timeline. We start with John as a kid in 1996. How Jordan is already a Green Lantern. He's on TV doing an interview for the first time. People are actually seeing who Hal Jordan is, Green Lantern. So immediately we understand. Green Lantern has history in this world, and then we get that scene with John's dad shooting an apple off his head, which is already wild. But you look behind John and see all those bullet holes progressively getting higher as he's grown. So it's definitely something that they've been doing for years. And my immediate thought was, has his dad been preparing him for something? Maybe Green Lanterns or maybe something else? Because that's a pretty specific way to teach your kid not to be afraid. We obviously don't know yet, but I'm keeping an eye on it. Then we jump forward and eventually get Hal and John together in 2016, and this is where their relationship really started working for me. Hal takes off his ring, puts it on the dashboard, and then jumps out of the car. John has to grab it and figure out how to save himself, and his solution is bubble wrap, which is honestly a really clever first construct. It's not flashy, it's practical, and that actually fits John really well. We don't see it, but in the comics, John is an architect, and DC specifically describes his constructs as unusually detailed because he mentally builds them from the inside out. The show isn't doing exactly that here, but I like that John's first instinct that is already what's the simplest thing I can build that'll actually work. And this is also where the show starts planting something else. something happened to Hal because John eventually accesses that younger version of Hal stored in the ring, and that backup is actually from 2006. Hal hasn't updated it in 10 years. The guy John grew up with watching on television and the guy standing in front of him in 2016 don't completely feel like the same person. So now there's already this question hanging over everything. What happened to Hal during those years? And before we really get an answer, the investigation takes them to Rushville. This is where the episode really hooked me. There's been the shooting, and Hal is basically immediately convinced that something extraterrestrial is involved. John isn't completely convinced. The sheriff definitely isn't convinced, but Hal has history here. Because about 20 miles away from Rushville is where he encountered Abin Sur and became Green Lantern. And again, I loved how simple they kept that. John basically asks him how he got the ring. Hal tells him, that's it. No giant flashback. No stopping the entire episode to retell Hal's origin. We know what happened and we keep moving. And now the location itself becomes suspicious because Hal became Green Lantern around here. And decades later, something extraterrestrial is apparently happening here again. Then we meet William Macon, and this dude immediately caught my attention because he already knows aliens are real. He's got people protecting this ranch, he's got weapons, and his entire mentality basically seems to be if you're not from Earth, you're potentially a threat to Earth. It gave me a little bit of that Lex Luthor mentality towards Superman. Not necessarily because they're the same character, but because that fear is coming from the same place. You know, you don't belong here and I don't trust what you're capable of. That kind of mentality. But the interesting part is Macon might actually know something. So I'm curious how much of his paranoia is paranoia and how much it's based on something he's actually seen. And meanwhile, John has been in Nebraska for all of 24 hours and has already managed to sleep with Macon's wife. And then Hal finds out, and that little interaction between them was great because it's another example of why Chandler and Pierre work together. Hal's not even really judging him, he's just impressed. And Aaron Pierre actually said after the premiere that the scene was meant to show that John's disciplined personality doesn't mean he's completely closed off. He knows what he wants, and sometimes he acts on it. And unfortunately for John, this particular decision could become a problem. Then we get to probably my favorite scene of the episode, the interrogation. Hal is completely convinced Wayland isn't human, and instead of asking him basic questions that anybody pretending to be human could research, he starts asking him random cultural shit. Harry Potter, Barack Obama, Kelly Clarkson. Things where it's less about knowing the correct answer and more about whether you react like somebody who's actually lived here. And slowly you see the sheriff start realizing, like, oh shit, how might actually be right? Waylon eventually starts talking hypotheticals about what an alien might think of Earth, and pretty quickly that hypothetical isn't feeling very hypothetical anymore. Then he starts beeping and he self destructs. And this is another moment when I really like the restraint with the ring. Hal doesn't make some massive weapon, he makes a shield around Waylon. Simple, effective. And now there's no question anymore. There are aliens in Rushville. Something is definitely happening here. And honestly, that alone would have been enough to make me want episode 2. But then the show jumps to 2026 and the whole mood changes. John comes back to Rushville. He's older. The town's covered in snow and just looks destroyed. He reconnects with the sheriff. They're talking about her son, where his life ended up, all that sort of stuff. And then she takes John out to the football field in the bleachers, and Hal is just sitting there, alone, dead. Apparently with a gunshot wound to his head. And his ring is gone. And I thought that was a great cliffhanger. But the thing that stuck with me wasn't even necessarily the shock of killing Hal Jordan in episode 1. It was how sad the whole thing felt. He's sitting by himself in these empty bleachers back in the same town that's tied to his investigation in the area where his life as Green Lantern began. And now John is the one finding him, especially after spending the episode seeing how complicated their relationship is. And apparently this wasn't something they came up with just to shock everybody in the premiere. Because Damon Lindelof said they originally assumed Gunn and Safran would never let them kill Hal this early, but Hal's death was part of the story they wanted to tell from the beginning. And Kyle Chandler also himself said that he described the reveal as a major storytelling punch and said part of what attracted him was how unpredictable and flawed this version of Hal could be. So now the episode has basically turned the entire season on its head because we have the mystery in 2016 and then we know where Hal ends up 10 years later. Now I want to know how those two things connect. And this is where we're going to do something every week. We're keeping track of theories. The obvious ones are, who killed Hal? Where's his ring? What happened between Hal and John during those 10 years? And how does the 2016 Rushville case connect to Hal ending up dead in the exact same town in 2026? But there's another detail I completely missed at first. This episode has a very deliberate pattern. 1986, Hal becomes Green Lantern. 1996, we see young John. 2006, Hal records the consciousness backup John eventually accesses. 2016, Rushville. 2026, Hal's death. That's 5 points exactly 10 years apart. Now, what does that mean? I have no idea. Maybe it's purely a storytelling device. Maybe something happens every 10 years. Maybe there's something specifically connecting these dates. But now that I know it's there, I'm watching for it. So that's officially theory board number one. But yeah, really strong first episode. It starts slow, but once it gets into Rushville, I think the mystery starts coming together really well. And I'm already invested in Hal and John's relationship enough that the ending actually meant something instead of just being there for shock value. That's really all I need from episode one. Give me characters I want to follow, give me a mystery I want answers to, and give me enough Green Lantern that I don't forget I'm watching a Green Lantern show. So far, they did that. And now I've got way more questions than answers, which for episode one of a mystery series, pretty much exactly where I want to be. But I'll see you guys after episode two.